It is a settled doctrine that Congress has the plenary power to legislate, subject to several constitutional limitations such as the Due Process Clause. You are assailing Section 4 of the Act for being violative of your right to due process. Which provision of this law is so unclear and ambiguous?
Section 4, if Your Honor, please, contains the definition of terrorism. It is our submission that that definition violates overbreadth, void for vagueness, and as well the strict scrutiny test. We submit, Your Honor, that the strict scrutiny test applies in this case because this law regulates speech based on its content. We are referring to Section 4 in relation to Section 9, Sections 5, 6, and 8, and 10 as well of the anti-terror law.
When we have already the IRR, and the IRR says the law punishes conduct coupled with nature and intent. Is
Your
that
Honor,
not a curative thing that will explain at least the big ambiguity in the law?
if that were inside the law itself, it may, Your Honor. However, if the fact that it is only in the IRR and not in the law itself cannot cure.
Can you read the law? The law, I think, is acts, nature, and content.
No,
Context. Is that not included in the law?
the law-
Acts plus nature and context.
The law, if Your Honor, please, refers to specific acts intended to.
But the law also mentions nature and context. Purpose.
Nature, yes.
I think the law mentioned that.
in
it's
relation
not-
to the purposes, Your Honor, that is correct.
Okay, can you make it clearer that the IRR did not explain the ambiguity in the law?
Well, we submit that statement in the IRR that the law
Explain
only
it in-
penalizes
explain-
conduct and not speech is in error, Your Honor, please.
Okay.
The
So
law
you-
itself clearly penalizes and restricts speech based on its content. That is found in Section 9, inciting to terrorism, Sections 5, 6, 8, and 10 on training, etc. Your Honor.
Based on Section 4, advocacy, protest, dissent, stoppage of work, industrial or mass action, and other similar exercises of civil and political rights, if not intended to cause death, blah, 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 are not punishable. Does this fall under the definition of protected speech?
That is precisely the problem, Your Honor. It has a colatilia that the exercise of these rights is not terrorism if it is not intended. And one of the problems with that, Your Honor, please, is we will leave it to the law enforcer to decide whether these exercises of rights have the requisite intent. Now, if Your Honor, please, the intent that was found in the anti-terror law is not the specific intent found in the revised penal code,
Okay.
because this is a special law. We are only referring to general intent, which is supposed, according to jurisprudence, presumed from the acts. So in
How-
other words, any law enforcer could presume the intent of a person exercising his rights and say that that is intended to endanger persons' lives, etc., and therefore qualifies as terrorism.
Further, Attorney Diokno, how do you consider this law? Is it a malum prohibitum or a mali in se law?
Well, it is a special law, if Your Honor, please. It is not a revised penal code law. In that sense, it is a malum prohibitum.
So it's a malum prohibitum as far as you're concerned.
Yes, Your Honor. Unlike, if I may point out, unlike the Human Security Act, which expressly incorporated Book 1 of the revised penal code, the anti-terror law does not mention at all the revised penal code.
Who bears the burden of showing presence and absence of intent? Is it not the government? According to the law and to the rules?
Yes, Your Honor, but the problem with this particular law is the fact that it includes in its definition exercise of civil and political rights, depending on the intent. Who will now decide whether that intent is present? Initially, it will be the arresting officer. Later on, it will be the prosecutor, and later on, it will be the judge.
So it's,
However, if I may, I'm sorry, Your Honor.
okay.
We would have no problem if the law required a predicate crime or criminal acts. However, the law does not. It did away with the requirement of predicate crime found in the Human Security Act. And therefore, intent may now be presumed from innocent, legitimate, non-criminal acts. And that is our concern, Your Honor, please.
Okay. If the government is able to prove such intent to cause damage, so and so, do you not agree that the act can be punished as terrorism?
We would have we would,
Remember, it's the government who will prove intent to cause damage, bodily injury, damage to critical infrastructure. Can it not be punished as an act of terrorism, falling under 1, 2, 3, 4?
precisely, Your Honor, the fact that that intent is simply presumed from acts that are non-criminal means that the law covers protected speech and conduct. As I mentioned in my opening statement, conduct, for example, that would be reminiscent.
Is it hard to prove intent?
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Is it hard to prove intent?
Well,
Criminal intent?
if
Is
you're
it hard
speaking
to
of
prove?
general intent found in the special law, no, Your Honor, because that is presumed from the acts. Generally, that would be presumed from a criminal act. But in
So-
this case, the acts are not criminal.
Since according to you, it's palum prohibitum, the act, there is presumption of intent by committing the act.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You are aware of the case of Brandenburg versus Ohio.
Yes, Your Honor.
The Supreme Court held that the state cannot forbid political speech that seems to advocate overthrowing the government unless it is both directed at inciting such action and is likely to actually incite it. In line with this test, consider this example. A social media influencer tweets to his 1 million followers that they must overthrow the current government by bombing Malacanang. However, this influencer did not actually commit any act. Can this statement be punished under Section 9 for inciting to terrorism?
The problem with Section 9 of the law, Your Honor, is that it does not incorporate the requirements of Brandenburg. The Brandenburg decision requires two elements for there to be a punishable advocacy: that the language is directed at inciting imminent lawless action and that it is likely to do so. That is not found in the law, if Your Honor, please. While there was an attempt by the implementing rules to include that, that is an essential element that should only be made by Congress and not within the province of the Anti-Terror Council.
So you will explain to us that the requirements of the Brandenburg versus Ohio case are not met.
Yes, Your Honor.
Since the petitioners argue that Section 9 of the ATA is unconstitutional for creating a chilling effect as regards the right to free speech and expression. However, there are several provisions in the revised penal code punishing inciting to commit certain acts, like 138 and 142. How do you differ this Section 9 from the provisions of the revised penal code?
I believe Your Honor is referring to the provisions on inciting to sedition.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Well, the purposes found in the elements of inciting to sedition are different from the elements of inciting to terrorism.
Here.
Yes, Your Honor. In fact, in the case of Escuelas, there was a dissent by one of the justices in that case.
What would be the difference?
Well, the sedition is really removing of allegiance, resistance to state authority. That is my understanding of that crime, Your Honor, please. And so far as terrorism is concerned, we are unsure ourselves of what, given the nebulous definition, it is really targeting.
Thank you, Attorney Diokno.
Thank you.
The floor to the other members of the court.
Justice, the Senior Associate Justice Bernabe,
is next. Go ahead.
Can I call Attorney Diokno, please?
Okay ba? Okay ba? Magtanong sa tanong natin.
Good afternoon, Attorney Diokno.
Okay ba?
Attorney Diokno, would you know if the definition of terrorism under Section 4 is a novel creation of Congress, or if it was just patterned on or inspired by the existing international instruments?
The Solicitor General claims that it was patterned after international standards, Your Honor, citing the proposed Convention on Terrorism that was initially submitted by India to the United Nations in 1996. However, Your Honor, when we compared the provisions of that proposed convention with the law itself here, there are significant differences. First, the convention mentions acts that cause death, damage to property, and so forth. Does not include the term intended to. In other words, it requires actual death, actual destruction, and so forth. Second, Your Honor, the convention only has two purposes: to compel the government to do or refrain from doing an act, and I believe to spread fear. It does not contain the other purposes that are found in our law.
Okay, I'll flash to you certain experts from various international instruments, such as the UN Security Council Resolution 1566. It's over there. The International Convention for the Suppression of Terrorist Bombings, and the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. Okay, as you can see, all of these instruments have semblance of similarity with our definition of terrorism, in that terrorism is generally characterized as acts intended to cause serious death or serious bodily injury or cause extensive damage to property.
If I may ask with the first slide, yes, as appearing in the slide, if Your Honor, please, the UN Security Council Resolution 1566 refers to criminal acts intended to cause. So there is that term criminal acts, but which we do not find in RA 11479. Our understanding as well, the European Union Directive of 2017/541 also makes reference to either predicate crimes or criminal acts, which are not found in our law.
All right, so the lack of reference to predicate crimes is what you are questioning
That is
in the
one of-
definition of terrorism.
Yes, Your Honor, I'm sorry. That is one of the concerns we have as well, the term critical infrastructure, because it can be used to suppress acts of exercise of civil and political rights that to us are constitutionally protected.
All right. Now, when Congress enacts a penal statute, does it define every word or term in the enactment?
Not necessarily, Your Honor.
And there's no positive statutory or constitutional command requiring Congress to really define every word or term.
Not every word, Your Honor. However, the operative words that give rise to the essential elements of the crime made by Congress, we believe, must be understood. And in the anti-terror law, the use of, for example, the inclusion of the term exercise of civil and political rights, which is not intended, that in itself gives rise to a lot of confusion.
All right. Would you agree with this statement? A statute which is generally worded is not necessarily void for vagueness, for as long as the legislative will is clear, or at least the intent can be gathered from the law through the principles of statutory construction.
Yes, Your Honor. In fact, I recall Your Honor's ponencia in the Spark case, where I believe that was the conclusion that you arrived at. However, in this particular case, we do submit that the law here fails the vagueness requirements of completeness and sufficient standards.
So, that what is the limitation of the court's power to interpret ambiguous laws?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I'm afraid I didn't get the question.
What are the limitations to the court's power to interpret laws?
Well, as far as interpretation of the laws is concerned, Your Honor, the court has a lot of discretion in terms of applying rules of construction and interpretation. The only thing it cannot do is substitute its judgment for what Congress has put into the law.
So for as long as the legislative will is clear, the court can interpret
Yes, Your Honor.
laws. Now let's go to the crime of inciting to commit terrorism. Is this assigned to you?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Now, the IRR provided for factors to consider in determining the existence of reasonable probability that the speeches would help ensure success in inciting the commission of terrorism. And I'm sure you know what these factors are. Now, can you say now that the supposed violation against freedom of expression has already been addressed by these clarifications?
We respectfully submit, Your Honor, that is ultra vires on the part of the Anti-Terror Council because that is part of the essential elements of the law. And only Congress can legislate what the law should contain as far as the essential elements are concerned.
So
We
you would
submitted
answer,
this- I'm sorry,
yes. So you would answer the same thing with respect to academic freedom.
insofar as the IRR is concerned.
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Now, are you also familiar with material support?
Yes, Your Honor. It's not one of my issues, but I am
Okay.
familiar with it.
Now, Section 6 of the Anti-Terrorism Act punishes the acts of planning, training, preparing, and facilitating the commission of terrorism. On the other hand, Section 12 of the same law penalizes the act of providing material support to terrorists.
Yes.
Now, assuming that a person comes up with a plan to bomb a critical government infrastructure, provides the funds for the weaponry of armed militants who are tasked to execute the attack, and the plan is later accomplished, can this person be both punished under Section 6 by facilitating terrorism and Section 12 by providing material support?
Yes,
Do you
I
think there's an overlap?
I believe there would be an overlap. That person could also be charged with the violation of Section 4 itself, I would submit, Your Honor.
Now, using the same scenario,
Using the same set of facts, yes.
using the same scenario I just mentioned, can you also say that there is an overlap with respect to Section 7 of the same law, which punishes conspiracy to commit terrorism?
Yes, Your Honor.
So a single act can now be penalized under Section 6, facilitating, Section 7, conspiracy to commit terrorism, or Section 12, material support, providing material support under the Anti-Terrorism Act.
And even if I may add the Section 4, Your Honor.
All right. Can the court clarify the interrelation of these offenses through jurisprudence and also their proper application for criminal prosecution?
While that may be in other laws, we submit that as far as this law is concerned, given the very nebulous, overbroad, and vague definition of terrorism, we submit that no amount of construction by the court could save it.
All right. Thank you, Attorney